Now, we only want to use our use effect in our components that have lifecycle methods, at least as far as our application is concerned. So the first one we know that we have is our component did mount in our app component. And this is pretty good because we're actually only leveraging the one component did mount method inside of this class method. It seems a little unnecessary to use a class component for just a simple component did mount. So what we can do is replace it with our use effect method. So first we convert our class, right, over to a functional component. We just got to make sure as well that we destructure off all the right props. And now we don't need this component did mount method anymore. We can use our use effect. Now, before we actually write the effect, let's just update our render as well so that we're not calling it. We also see that we pass in current user, so let's just definitely update that as well. To destructure. And as far as our effect goes, we need to call check user session. So here we can just invoke it, but we only want it the first time when we actually pass it in. So what we can do, if we don't want it to fire whenever current user updates, is we can pass in an empty array. Now, the thing is that we'll see that we have this warning that says use effect has a missing dependency of check user session. So we should either include it or remove it from this dependency array. Because if check user session changes too often, our parent component that defines it will possibly re-render this whole component. So the idea is that if there was a parent to this component, whenever check user session changes, right, when it gets rendered, it's possible that we would essentially end up re-rendering this component and firing off our effect more than we needed to. Well, here's the thing. Let's say we don't do this, right? Let's say we don't pass the array. What will happen is that when our component mounts, we see that we're still calling our check user session. We get a sign in success because, of course, our check user session will say that we're still logged in. And then we'll re-sign in, right, getting our persistence effect that we just set up in our Saga, if you remember from a couple lessons ago. But you'll see that we fire our check user session again. And this, of course, is because our component re-rendered because current user got updated, right, when we signed in. So what we can do in order to alleviate this, just because of the nature of how this component is being rendered, is we can pass this check user session into our dependency array, which is perfectly fine. The reason we do this is because check user session is a property function that is being passed in from our map dispatch to props. Now, if this was, say, a property that we were passing in from a parent component, we would actually do something different, but we're going to tackle that in another lesson. Right now, it's not relevant to this app because there's no component higher than our app component. And check user session is being passed in from map dispatch to props. So of course we can do that and talk about that in another lesson because it is an important thing to talk about. But right now this is equivalent, right? This is working. Because we know check user session is not going to change. This function technically doesn't need to update. We can simply just pass it in and now this behaves like a component did mount. And we'll see that after signing success, we do not fire our check user another time. So we also see that we have our header component no longer uses auth. So we can update that as well. So let's get rid of this auth dependency. And let's update any other components where we're using component did mount with our new use effect method. So here we can see our shop page is very similar to what we had with our app component. So here, let's import in our use effect method. And let's update this into a functional component. Let's make sure that we delete our render. And here we see that we get our match, right? Which we destructure from props, as well as fetch collection start. So now we just simply call our use effect, and we just call fetch collection start. This is actually a good time for us to talk about how use effect will get triggered, right? As well as re-render cycles. Because that's one of the big caveats with use effect, is how it fires and when we want it to fire, right? Because it might cause us some side effects that we don't want. Now, when we talk about rendering cycles in our components, we know that our shop page will only re-render if either our props change, or if we called set state inside, if we use the use state hook, or if the parent of this component, which is our app.js, ends up calling its own re-render. And the only time we know that will happen is if current user updates. Now, if we do not listen for that kind of change, we will actually end up calling use effect twice. So let me show you what happens if we do not pass in our array. If we're on our shop page, we know that what happens is that when our component mounts for the first time, it fires off the first fetch collection start effect. But let's say after our component mounts, our app also fires check user session, right? Which checks if there is an existing session for our user. If there is, it signs in a new user, current user gets passed in, and then we re-render our app component. This re-render will in turn trigger our shop page component to also re-render, which will also now in turn trigger our use effect again, causing us to call fetch collection start twice. So if we refresh, we'll see we called fetch collection start, and you see how we flickered again after check user session? Well, this is because we ended up calling sign in success, which ends up calling fetch collection start again. So that's what happens because our components mount, right? Our shop page mounts for the first time, as well as our app component. This triggers our use effect to call for fetch collection start the first time. Right here. Our check current user session gets fired, which in turn will then trigger a check against our Firebase store to see if there is a session. At this point, our fetch collection success, which is our initial fetch collection start call, comes back, succeeds, renders our page. Well, then after our check user session comes back with a success saying there is a session, which then triggers our sign in success saga. This will in turn re-render our app component because current user is now different, which re-triggers the render here, re-triggering a rendering of our shop page, which in turn will re-trigger our use effect, because use effect will fire whenever re-render is called. Now, as a result, we'll see fetch collection start get fired again, and then we see that double flicker effect, right? It flickers once, and then it flickers twice. So we don't want this to happen. So what we can do is, of course, we can pass this empty array, and here we can say only if fetch collection start changes. So now we see we don't get that effect. Why is that? Well, the reason for this is because normally we would just pass in an empty array. It does the same thing, but we will get this warning. And the reason is because our function being passed in is a prop. But we do know that this prop will not change because we're getting it from our map dispatch to props. So if we know that this is not going to re-render, well then, we simply do it to avoid that warning message. Otherwise, right, we're just not going to fire use effect more than one time. This is just the caveat with the fact that we're passing in methods from a dispatch from Redux into our component, and we're calling in our use effect, right? The use effect is not aware that this is not coming from our connect function. It simply thinks that we're getting a prop that we're calling inside of use effect. So we just got to beware that in case that function changes, right? useEffect just wants us to know that this is a dependency. It doesn't want us to have an old stale version of the prop. And I know it sounds rather complicated, but this will make more sense the more you actually encounter useEffect, right? It's just one of those caveats of useEffect. But for our case, right, we simply want to use it like a component did mount. So we have no problem passing fetch collection start. And now, again, we won't end up with that double render because we are no longer listening for useEffect to trigger even if our re-render happens. So this doesn't stop our re-render cycle on our shop page from happening when current user updates app again. We're just simply saying we just don't want to fire a useEffect again. That's the only thing that we're doing with this second parameter. So hopefully that made sense. I know it's complicated, and I know useEffect is a little bit weird like that, but this is the main thing about useEffect, integrating it into an existing Redux application that is using dispatch. We simply just have to make sure that we wrap our fetch collection start right inside of this array as the second parameter, if we plan to call it inside of our useEffect as a component did mount. All in all, a pretty easy change to switch over our application to using the useState and useEffect hooks. Now, there is one more way that we can use the useEffect hook to mimic our component will unmount lifecycle method, but we don't really need to do it inside of any of our components. But in the next lesson, I will show you how we can do it if we needed to leverage that lifecycle method as well. So I'll see you in the next lesson.